What's happening, everybody? All right, so in this video, what I wanted to do was boil down a value proposition for you guys that are looking to build power with a Gen 3 Hemi. What is the best bang for the buck? Where should you spend your money? I'm going to say some things that may ruffle some feathers a little bit and may sound a little bit counterintuitive, but keep in mind, I've been around these things for quite a while, and at this stage of the game, I've figured out a thing or two about these engines and really the best way to spend money on them. So hopefully I don't offend anybody too much with this video, but I am going to be a bit direct and pretty much straight to the point with this. So let's get to it. One of the most common questions that I get asked about are camshafts. Yes, I do spec camshafts for builds. Spec them for quite a few shops, as a matter of fact, and they do perform well. But from a value proposition, they're a complete waste of money. Let me explain to you why. Garden variety 5.7 liter car is going to put down around 325 horsepower to the rear wheels on an eddy current dyno. With a camshaft, you'll be doing very well to spin that dyno to around 365 to 375 to the rear wheels. That is a generous improvement of 50 horsepower to the rear wheels. You might say, well, man, that's great. Well, it is until you start to break down what the cost of that install is, along with all of the components that you're going to need. Once you order the camshaft, the springs, the push rods, the stanky tie bars and collars, the long tube headers, the tuning that has to take place, you're going to be into that for usually around $55-ish $100. So basically $5,000 is your pivot number. A little bit less, a little bit more depending on a deal that you get. That's about $100 per horsepower or a little bit more than that. And although that is basically the going rate, I want you to consider this. What happens if you want to sell that car? You've got to find somebody that wants a cammed 5.7 in this case. Kind of difficult to do. And then when you step that up to a 6.4, well, let's talk about that for a minute. Garden variety 6.4 liter is going to lay down somewhere in the neighborhood of about 410 horsepower to the rear wheels on an eddy current dyno. Again, you'll be doing extremely well to spin those rollers to somewhere around 450 to 470, and that is a stretch, by the way. Is it worth it at that point? Well, you're looking at about 60-ish horsepower, but still close to $6,000. And you've only spun the rollers to what is in essence 450, 460 horsepower. Or you've spent $5,000 plus to make significantly less horsepower than a Hellcat. Now, I don't want to get into the value proposition of Hellcat here, but just keep that in the back of your mind when you start to try to add up what you're going to spend, what it's going to cost, and everything else when you're putting one of these combinations together. Not to mention, that combination may not even be street legal where you live. Camshafts aren't EPA approved. They're not. There is no executive order. There's very few executive orders that I can think of for camshafts, and there's obviously no carb exemption that I'm aware of that goes along with that. So that could potentially be an issue. So cams for me for the Gen 3 Hemi, although they sound good, they add a little bit of theater to the car, probably not the best value proposition. Well, then you might say, well, what about bolt-on type stuff just in general? Long tube headers, ported intake, ported throttle body. Look, yeah, you'll get some gains out of that. I think the walking around accepted value for a ported intake and larger throttle body is around 6 to 8 horsepower and 6 to 8 pound-feet of torque. Long tube headers don't really gain you a lot of horsepower on a 6.4, but you might pick up 15, but keep in mind on a 5.7, but keep in mind this is always going to be part of a tuned combination. Full bolt-on combination might yield you somewhere around 35 horsepower to the rear wheels at the most. And this is, again, being incredibly generous, and we're talking about a 5.7 here. A 6.4 is going to benefit significantly less. It comes from the factory with significantly better hardware. So a full bolt-on car may go from 410 horsepower to 435 horsepower, maybe 25 horsepower, or about half of the value of a freaking camshaft. But what you're going to spend there is going to be pretty significant. Tuning is going to be involved. You're going to have somewhere around $1,500 in headers. You're going to have, as close as it doesn't really matter, let's say $750 in a ported intake and a throttle body, if not more than that. Call it $1,000 just for ease of speaking. You're still looking at about $100 per horsepower. And about the only thing you will have picked up with your bolt-on combination, notice I'm kind of going backwards here, but the only thing that you're going to pick up with your bolt-on combination is really some drivability, and that's it. Most of the time when you're just talking about a tune, now we're really at the base level here. When you're talking about a tune, you're only going to pick up maybe 15 horsepower at the most, or about half of what you would pick up with all of your bolt-on components. And that's really for a 6.4 or a 5.7. Is that worth it? Considering you're going to be into a tune, if you're going with HP tuners, tuning in and of itself, you're looking at probably $1,500, not including or potentially including, depending on the shop that you deal with, the unlocking of the computer, which may be necessary. Later cars will need a smart cable, which is going to cost you another $150 to install. You can see where this is going. You're looking at a lot of cost, you're looking at a lot of expenditure, but not a whole lot of gain. So where do you go with this? Well, quite frankly, you go with supercharging. The reason why I'm eliminating nitrous oxide from this, I'm going to squash the elephant in the room right now, is that nobody will put the right controller, nobody will install the nitrous kit the right way. It always works out like this. Well, I can put nitrous in this thing for $2,500 and that's a 150 shot right there. I've got 150 shot at the hit of a button. Well, yeah, you do. But let me tell you what nitrous oxide does to every other component that's in contact with that engine. Namely, transmission gets hit with a huge torque hit. Had issues with them glazing clutches practically. Basically, the transmission slips. Hits the rear end hard, hits the axles hard, and hits the drive shaft hard. Now, luckily, on a 5.7 car, you've got some room to play around with in terms of what they will handle power adder-wise. Doesn't necessarily play as easily with 6.4 cars. But the other side to this is that typically guys won't install the kits properly. They're not going to go a shade down with their spark plug range. They're not going to go from a 6 to a 7 at least. And more than likely, they're not going to put a tune on it. They're just going to see what they can get away with. Let the fates determine what ends up happening to that engine. Funny how they're the first ones to cry about the engine not being able to handle nitrous when they probably didn't install it the right way. Lots of problems with nitrous oxide. Too many people think they can get away with technology that was perfectly functional and worked just great in 1979. But modern V8, modern electronics, modern all of that, I'd steer as far away from nitrous oxide as possible unless you are putting in the right controller and you're taking all the necessary precautions to make nitrous oxide work in your car. And in that case, I guess it's going to be the best bang for the buck proposition, provided that you stay on top of your maintenance items, which is to say you need to be swapping out your solenoids every year. You need to make sure you're bleeding that system down before you start your car. You need to make sure that there is no pressure in the line when you go to start your car. You need to make sure that, you see where this is going? It stops being really sexy when you have to babysit your nitrous kit. But when you've seen a couple of intakes explode, sending bits and pieces flaming into the night, you basically start to learn a thing or two about why people don't necessarily flock to nitrous oxide. So there's my soapbox talk on nitrous. for the Gen 3 Hemis. It's really protecting you from yourselves, guys. So getting back to boost, what kind of boost do you want? Well, let's start out with most of the kits costing. Most of the kits, not including turbos, whether it's a Pro Charger or a Maggie or an E-Force, whatever the case is, you're looking at around $8,000 to $10,000 plus tuning, plus a fuel system, plus install. In total, most of the time, you're going to spend around $15,000 to $17,000 for the kit. Sounds like a lot of money, but you're going to make somewhere around 130-ish horsepower to the rear wheels gain over stock. So in other words, let's say you've got a 6.4, you put a Maggie on the car, and now it's making 550 horsepower to the rear wheels. Well, if you started off with a healthy 6.4, around 410 horsepower, then yeah, that's 140 horsepower to the rear wheels for about, call it $14,000. But you get power everywhere all the time, and should you choose at any time to sell the kit, return the car back to stock, you can do that with those supercharger kits. Now, I'm bringing up a positive displacement supercharger first because that's what I would recommend. The reason for that, this is where guys get it a little bit wrong in terms of putting a Pro Charger on these things. The cam that comes in the 5.7 and the 6.4 has a very wide lobe separation angle, which is beautiful when you're working with a positive displacement supercharger. It helps to push power further out in the RPM range, and it allows for a better boost response, better throttle response, more kick, if you will, with just partial throttle application. The reason why I don't necessarily recommend a Pro Charger is because of the wide lobe separation angle. Pro Chargers tend to feel a little bit soft, and they want to try to push the power further out than it is already set up by the factory in terms of, and what I mean by set up is valve train stability, spring pressures, and things like that, being able to manage higher RPM. Pro Charger, realistically, if you want to do it right, is going to want to drive that power out to 6,700, 6,800 RPM with that wide lobe separation angle. Drag all of that back, put a blower on the top of that thing that's going to give you all the torque that you need to move your barge of an LX platform, give you something that's fun to drive, and basically create what I would consider to be Hellcat Light and Hellcat Junior. That's what I would do if it were mine. I've seen and I've driven these combinations. They're a lot of fun to drive. They get down the drag strip very well. No, they're not Hellcat fast. But here's the twist. They don't have to be Hellcat fast to be hella fun. And again, because you can remove these components and sell them on, pretty good deal all the way around. You still are going to pay $100 per horsepower, just like what you were doing beforehand, whether it was a tune, bolt-ons, or a cam or anything like that. But at least in this case, you can see that money again and enjoy the vehicle in the process. Plus, realistically, as long as you're running street tires, they're not going to be too hard on components. So, my value proposition to you guys, if you're deciding that you want to really get into modifying one of these Gen 3 Hemis, is to go that supercharger route. Find a distributor that can work with you in terms of getting you fuel system components, the compressor, which is the blower itself, and everything to you, and can hook you up with a tuner that can fine-tune this thing for you. Do that, and you will be in love with your combination. And with that, I'm going to wrap it up. Post up your comments. Let me know what you think, and I'll catch y'all on the next one. Adios.